What if I told you that one of the most chilling zombie attacks in human history didn't come from fiction, but from the trenches of World War I? On August 6, 1915, at a remote fortress in modern-day Poland, German soldiers encountered something so terrifying they fled the battlefield in panic. The attackers? Men who should have been dead. Men whose lungs were melting, faces disfigured, eyes hollow, and yet they advanced. Today on Sketchy Tunes, we're revisiting the day zombies attacked in World War I. This isn't the plot of a low-budget horror movie, nor is it a forgotten folktale. It's a real moment in history when the line between horror and reality disappeared, and the undead walked the earth. At least, that's how it must have seemed. To understand why this moment resonated so powerfully, we need to explore the mental battlefield of World War I. This wasn't just a war of bullets or bombs or brutality. It was also a war of symbols. Propaganda painted enemies not merely as soldiers, but as monsters. The Germans were often dehumanized in Allied posters, depicted as beastly apes, dagger-wielding maniacs, and glowing-eyed invaders crawling across the globe like the plague. But the other side wasn't immune to this. German posters depicted soldiers battling multi-headed hydras, giant spiders, and even the figure of death himself. All metaphors for the Allied powers. Meanwhile, Entente forces frame themselves as more angelic. Literally. The legend of the Angel of Mons, divine figures protecting British soldiers, became part of trench beliefs. And somewhere in between these extremes was the zombie. Before George A. Romero gave us brain-hungry ghouls, World War I poets and artists gave us a different kind of zombie. Not terrifying because it killed, but because it survived. Soulless, mechanized, unfeeling. Nowhere did the transformation from man to monster become more literal than in chemical warfare. World War I saw the dawn of poison gas, weaponized air, a new kind of terror. The first large-scale attack was at Ypres in 1915. Chlorine gas burned lungs, turned eyes blind, and skin raw. Troops suffocated while still standing. Some tried to protect themselves with urine-soaked rags. At Ossowiec Fortress in eastern Poland, the Germans used a mix of chlorine and bromine gas. More devastating still. Here's what it did to the human body. The chlorine reacts with water from the lungs to form hydrochloric acid. The lungs dissolve. The victims cough up pink froth and pieces of lung tissue. The eyes blister and swell. The skin turns black and green. Finally, death, if you were lucky. And on August 6, 1915, this hell was unleashed on the Russian combatants of Auschwitz in what is now known as the Attack of the Dead Men. At dawn, the Germans released the gas, knowing that the Russian garrison lacked sufficient gas protection and masks. A sickly green cloud rolled towards the fortress. The birds fell silent. The air stilled. Inside, the Russian garrison, unexpecting, unprepared, under-equipped, suffered horrifically. Some died within minutes. Others clawed at their throats in silence. But not all perished. Around 60 to 100 men survived from the initial 800, and they were survivors in only a technical sense. They rose, coughing blood and pieces of their own lung tissue, flesh discolored and faces half melted. Some had their uniforms eaten through by acid. Their eyes were red, hollow, unseeing. They looked like corpses that hadn't realized that they were dead. And they advanced. The Germans had expected walkover. Instead, they saw what appeared to be the risen dead charging at them through smoke and ruin. The phrase, "Attack of the Dead Men," was born. And the Germans could do nothing but run. Why did trained German soldiers, who held the high ground and vastly outnumbered the Russians, break ranks in a mass panic in such haste that many discarded their weapons? Because this was horror, not conventional combat. It was the ultimate battlefield equivalent of a nightmare. In a war full of them, the enemy was already dead, and yet they wouldn't stop. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was already widespread in World War I. Men spoke of shadows in no man's land. Wild men who screamed and crawled through the mud, ghostly specters of war. The Auschwitz defenders became a literal manifestation of these hallucinations. Gas-burned, bloodied, hollow-eyed, limping, dissolved, but still relentless. Psychologically, it wasn't just fear. It was a primitive phobia. The fear that death itself was no longer a limit, that this war could produce things beyond death. Were they really zombies? No, not in the modern pop culture sense anyway. There was no virus, no mindless contagion, no hunger for human flesh. But from the German perspective, they may as well have been. Even the scientific descriptions read like horror. The melting of their skin, blood foaming from their mouths, the blackening of their lungs, the silent, stumbled, erratic method of attack. The men who advanced were not at this point alive as we think of it. They were animated by sheer will, or rage, or agony, or perhaps just basic instinct. They weren't monsters, but they were monstrous. These Russian dead men who launched the desperate counterattack didn't just scare the Germans, they bought time for themselves. In the immediate moments following the Russian counterattack, the battlefield at Auschwitz Fortress was a surreal mix of silence and disbelief. The German soldiers, who had moments before been executing a methodical assault bolstered by their chemical weapons and overwhelming firepower, were now in full retreat, many throwing down their weapons, some screaming, some tripping and tearing themselves open on their own barbed wire. Panic had overtaken precision. What they fled from was not a superior force, but a horror that their minds couldn't reconcile with reality. Soldiers who should have been long dead, shambling toward them with flesh burned, uniforms soaked in blood and acid, coughing up pieces of their own internal organs. Men who looked like they had clawed their way out of the grave. The sudden retreat of the German 11th Landwehr Division, some 7,000 men, meant a pause in their assault on the Auschwitz fortress. The initial plans for attack had involved 14 battalions, heavy artillery, and a staggering amount of poisonous gas. These plans were scrambled. The fear that had taken root in their minds had stalled their momentum. The haunting image of undead Russian soldiers remained burned into the psyche of those who witnessed it. For a brief moment, Auschwitz stood, defiant, scarred, and ghostly. And yet, the Russian dead men hadn't survived unscathed. Many collapsed shortly after the charge. Some likely died minutes later, their internal injuries too severe to sustain life. The chlorine and bromine gas that they had inhaled had irreparably damaged their respiratory systems. Their lungs, tissue, and organs had been eaten away from the inside. They fought on pure instinct, on adrenaline, duty, and defiance. Crippled and diminished, they held on. Those who did not survive were lauded immediately as heroes. Most were taken behind the lines for emergency treatment, though the medical capabilities at the time were highly ill-equipped for chemical warfare injuries. A significant number died in the days that followed, not from bullets or shrapnel, but from the slow, invisible poison of the gas. Yet, for all the physical suffering that the Russians endured, the Germans had faltered. The 13th Company launched another assault on the 18th German Regiment, successfully forcing them into another retreat. Despite suffering from the lingering gas attack, a desperate bayonet charge was launched, and the Germans were eventually completely driven out of their sections of the Sosnenskaya position. The zombified Russian defenders had repossessed their defenses, but the writing was on the wall. The fortress was surrounded, and it could not hold forever. Reinforcements were not coming, supplies were dwindling, encirclement was imminent. Despite their heroism, the Russian defenses knew that they would be unable to prevent another German advance. Russian command made the decision to evacuate, and 3 weeks after the initial attack, on August 18, 1915, the Russian forces moved out of Osijek. But they didn't surrender it. Instead, it was a strategic withdrawal. Before leaving, Russian engineers rigged the fortress with explosives, collapsing tunnels and destroying artillery positions. When German troops advanced again, returning to seize the fort, though more cautiously this time, they found nothing but smoke and stone, rubble and ruin. What had once been a symbol of indomitable defense was now gone, abandoned on Russian terms rather than in their defeat. Osijek had finally fallen, but not to German strength, only to Russian strategy. The story could have ended there, another chapter of loss in a long war of attrition. But it didn't. The dead men hadn't won the war, and the end of it was far off. But they had won something else, a tale that would outlive them. None of those men should have been able to stand, and yet they did. None of those men should have been able to fight, and yet they charged. The memory of their attack refused to fade. Stories spread across both sides of the front. Survivors spoke of what they saw, not with clarity, but with the disbelief of people who had witnessed the impossible. The tale took on the cadence of legend, and over time, the men who made that last horrific charge came to represent something deeper. Not just the victims of gas warfare, not merely the soldiers in a forgotten, fallen fortress, but the avatars of a war that stripped away everything human. A war where death collided with myth, where horror transcended the battlefield and became allegory. These men died not as monsters, but as human beings so mutilated by industrial warfare that they could no longer be recognized as such. And that was the point. The final defenders of a doomed fort, whose bodies failed them, but whose will did not. History is full of strange echoes, moments so unusual, so grotesquely poetic, that they outlive the era that they came from. The story of the attack of the dead men is one of those echoes. For decades after World War I, the story of Osijek remained largely buried in classified military archives, shared only in specialized history texts, and remembered within certain Russian, German, and Polish circles. It was the kind of tale that felt too bizarre, too nightmarish for mainstream remembrance. In contrast to something like Normandy D-Day in World War II, the dead men of Osijek may never walk into a history textbook beside the battles of Verdun or the Somme, but they may have found something stranger. Not just a place in military lore, but a place in collective imagination. Over a century later, it was reborn in the most unexpected form. In 2019, Swedish power metal band Sabaton released their album The Great War, a concept album focusing on historical battles across the centuries. One track, simply titled The Attack of the Dead Men, catapulted Osijek into a whole new realm. The world of heavy metal, myth, and fandom. The song isn't just a retelling, it's an anthem. It captures the visceral insanity of the event with pounding drums and militaristic precision. The chorus echoing like a war cry, using lyrics like, "Facing the lead once again, 100 men charge again, die again." For many modern listeners, Sabaton wasn't just entertainment, it was education. Suddenly, this obscure story from the Eastern Front of World War I was trending on YouTube, filling forums and prompting fans to Google Osijek Fortress and dive into the morbid details. What had once been buried became something shared, debated, and even celebrated. But it goes beyond music. The image of the dead men touches something primal, something that resonates through horror cinema, zombie fiction, and video games. The idea of mutilated, shambling figures marching forward in defiance of death predates even Romero's zombies, but Ossovic gave it a real-life face. Writers, artists, and game developers have mined this historical moment for inspiration, whether consciously or not. In Call of Duty, Metro 2033, Battlefield 1, and countless other franchises, we see gas-masked, grotesque figures battling in post-apocalyptic ruins, reflecting, perhaps consciously, the same terror those German soldiers felt in 1915. And then there's the meme culture. Yes, Ossovic, like many stories on the edge of believability, found its way into forums, Reddit threads, and TikTok explainers. History buffs online began calling the defenders the original zombies. A simplification, of course, but one that demonstrates just how much this tale has mutated and evolved in the public consciousness. But we should be careful with that comparison, because what makes the dead men so chilling isn't that they were zombies. It's that they were very much alive. They felt everything: the pain, the suffocation, the terror, and they charged anyway. And so when this story is adapted into fiction, it walks a fine line between honoring the horror these men endured and turning them into monsters, between tribute and trope. Yet there's value even in that transformation. Stories like these persist because they touch something deeper than fact. They become symbols of war's grotesque creativity, of what a human body can endure, of how thin the line is between bravery and madness, between death and legend. And it fits, because war itself is inhuman, evil, industrial, and impersonal. It turns men into numbers, into bodies, into ghosts, and in this case, it made them rise again. The men at Ossovic didn't crave brains. They weren't undead by curse or contamination. They were men, staggering, bleeding, suffocating, who refused to die. The tale has lived on because it defies explanation. It demands to be retold, not as a scary story to tell in the dark, but as a testament to pain, to survival, to the terrifying lengths that humanity can be pushed to and still push back. Their legacy lives, not in B-movies, but in something deeper, the reminder that war strips away our humanity until even endurance becomes monstrous. They weren't zombies. They were something worse. They were survivors. In the end, the dead men of Ossovic didn't rise from their graves. They never went down in the first place.